So we are going to get started right at 2:15. We're just waiting for the video to get up and going. Okay, if those of you who are standing in the back can go ahead and take your seats again. I know the networking is great here. We have 6 amazing panelists who are all combined here for this session. Hi, I'm Christina Culver. I'm president of EdNexus Advisors. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., and I spend my time doing government relations and business strategy for a lot of areas and really cover the regulatory environment for education technology companies looking to scale in the innovation space, as well as working with charter schools and family offices who are investing in charters and trying to figure out how to make this whole thing work. So this has been a really interesting day for me as well, hearing about how we move forward. So this session is on how regulation is stifling innovation. And it really is across the board, both in the private sector and in the public sector. And we see that happening rampantly in higher ed and for-profit higher ed, as well as there's so many things, so many policies in place, as we talked about all day today, that really hamper the growth of innovation, whether it's in the charter school market or private schools or all the things that go on with schooling. So we have several people here today who have been spending a lot of time thinking and discussing this and really making some interesting proposals around this area and what is to come ahead. You know, we're really on the cusp right now of the election, and I quite frankly, I know that it's really complicated what's going on with the election, but you have the promise of either more heavy regulation or the promise of we're not really sure what's going to happen. So I think that, but there's one thing we know is that that there is a lot of pattern over the last arguably 16 years of a lot of control from the top up, and we're looking for a way to change that, particularly returning a lot to the local level through the recent passage of ESSA. So we have a number of folks here, and I'm going to turn it right over. We have Max Eden and Matt Ladner, who are going to first open up with 10 minutes each, talking about their positions. Max is the senior fellow from Manhattan Institute for Policy Research. And Max, I'm going to give you an extra loud microphone because he seemed to have lost a good portion of his voice from yelling and screaming and supporting the Indians last night. So, so hopefully he has better luck promoting today what he's here to talk about.
Good afternoon, everybody. They say it's good to start a presentation with a joke, but I kind of figured because despite my hairline, I'm still a millennial, I would start with a meme. So the meme is regs, where we're going, we don't need regs, Back to the Future, for the charter schools. So to date myself a little bit, I was not born when this movie came out. I saw it 10 years after it came out when I was 7 years old, so I am still, however, old enough to remember when the future was supposed to be cool. Like, I thought that the Indians were going to win the World Series. I thought so 2 years later. I thought so 20 years later. I thought there were going to be hoverboards by now, and I'm sorely disappointed. So now that we're in it, the future just seems less cool than it used to. I don't have a voice that's less cool than I thought this was going to be. But rather than wallow in the nostalgia or talk about days gone by that I wasn't really there for, I thought it'd be useful to go back to the very beginning and ask a very basic question, which is, what is a charter school? This was given the year that I was born. Al Shanker, I will commit a horrible millennial sin of reading directly from the PowerPoint because I don't think I could say it better. Do not think of a school as a building and you can see how it works. Consider 6 or 7 or 12 teachers in a school who say, we've got an idea. We've got a way of doing something very different. We've got a way of reaching the kids that are not now being reached by what the school is doing. The school would announce in advance to the community what it is trying to do and achieve, and announce how it's going to test it, how it wants to prove that what it can do. And then finally, it would also admit something, that we really just don't know how to reach the 80% of the kids. Nobody's really educated all of them and that therefore we are engaged in a search. That sounds pretty cool to me. Now, Schenker obviously ended up turning against charter schools for reasons that I think are pretty valid. He didn't think that they were going to be schools. He didn't think they were going to be ununionized, and he didn't think that they would have a particular socio-demographic mission. And I would contend that now the vision of charter schools is that charter schools are public schools that are designed to drive higher academic performance, especially for low-income students of color. This is a good thing. This is a noble mission, but it's not the same thing as that. And my argument today is that in trying to do this, we are taking it further and further away from that, which I tend to think could be a more exciting future. So it's kind of what we're going to talk about is, to my mind, what the 4 pillars of charter regulation are, what they're designed to achieve, and how they take us further away from what I think is a pretty diverse, dispersed, and potentially robust sector that we aren't quite having. The 4 as I see them is 1, exert both moral and political pressure for charters to serve primarily low-income students of color. 2, to justify charter schools first and foremost in terms of test results. 3, to raise barriers to entry to focus on authorizing schools that promise gains in test scores. And 4, to shut down schools that pose lower test scores. And again, if our goal is this, then everything that we are doing is perfectly designed for that. We will set up schools for children who we think need them. We will not allow people to teach in ways that we don't think will raise test scores. We will shut down the ones that don't. So perfectly well-suited and well-tailored. And kind of per Jay's point, I'm not really sure that, I mean, this is the consensus that I think the education reform community, the 300, so to speak, has coalesced around. I don't know that it's the consensus nationwide. I don't really think that it is. I think that it probably has more effect than Jay might on the way that it's kind of taking the sector. So I wanted to go through each of these 4 and talk about the downsides, which I think are mostly swept under the rug in the way that we talk about charter schools. First, the downside to shutting down schools that pose lower test scores. For one thing, we might be sending kids back into violence and having absolutely no idea that we are doing it. We know that the first and foremost in Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that parents want their kids to be safe. That is what they say they send their kids to a non-public school for. When we have a school with lower test results and we shut it down and we don't figure out what was going to happen to the kid otherwise, we're actually maybe really hurting the kid, possibly physically. We're probably going to discourage providers from reaching the hardest to serve kids. This goes back to Gerard's point. If you're thinking that you want to try to start a charter school that will serve the most disadvantaged kids, you know there's going to be a drop in score on transmission, and you have a system that after 1 or 2 years of Fs, you're going to shut down the school. You'd be kind of crazy to start one. Maybe you just have a lot of gall, good for you, but it seems like a discouragement. Certainly you would be less prepared to serve those kids in ways that are out of the box, because you know that your continued existence would hinge on the test results that you post. And when it comes to default closures, we almost certainly override the preferences of parents and students when we explicitly shut down schools despite their preferences because of low test scores. This is not really something that charter advocates seem to have any compunction about. This is from the 1 Million Lives campaign by NACSA. The goal is to affect 1 million students either by shutting down or opening a charter school, which puts a moral equivalence on shutting down and opening a charter school, which I find peculiar. Of the 250,000 students whose schools have been shut down, I contend that we know next to nothing. We don't know how many of those students went to schools that closed because parents didn't want them, or how many students went to those schools were closed despite high parent demand. I know that we don't know this because in an exchange between Jay Green and Mike Petrilli, Greg Richmond was asked how many schools with waitlists have been closed, and he says he has no idea. Probably hundreds, and does it bother him? No, or hell no. When it comes to these schools, how many of them are potentially offering kids things that they wouldn't be able to get in a public school that won't show up in test results that could really change life trajectories that we were talking about times past? That's also a question that charter advocates think are beyond the bounds of discussion. So this is maybe the biggest thing that I think is swept thoroughly under the rug when we talk about charter regulation. The second is barriers to entry. There has been some work done on this, done by my former colleague, Mike McShane, and Downsides here are pretty obvious. We will probably discourage small-scale endeavors by talented groups. I'm not at all convinced that encouraging hundreds upon hundreds of pages of applications actually gives us quality rather than just promoting puffery and outsourcing. And we will favor incumbents and traditional school types. And so two just little stats to take away, one by my former colleague Mike. He estimated that there's probably about 700 hours that are entirely unnecessary in a charter charter application. And that might have something to do with the fact that from 5 years ago to today, the average number of applications received per large authorizers has dropped by half. When we justify charter schools through test scores, we come to two big problems. One is that he who lives by the score will also die by the score. We kind of can't avoid saying charters are good because look at these test scores, but if we do that, we also have to concede that charters are bad when they don't pose good test scores, which is a very consequentialist notion and something that can trip us up. But more importantly, and this goes back to the thing from last session, what are we constricting by focusing charter schools on test scores? This is a quote by Doug Harris, who I think has more confidence in test scores than Jay might, but he said that there hasn't been that much actual innovation as maybe the charter folks hoped, because when you have intense test-based accountability, it restricts what you can do. It restricts what you can innovate. There are only so many ways to drive a good test result, and this might be part of the reason why 55% of charter schools don't even on their website pretend to differentiate themselves in a qualitative way from a neighboring public school. And finally, the moral pressure to serve primarily low-income students of color. There's a great, this forms a lot of passion, a lot of drive, a lot of energy. I think we're seeing the political downsides this year. A lot of education reformers were shocked that the NAACP turned against charter schools. I have no idea why they were shocked. I think when you make a primarily race-based case for a given policy and you face backlash, that should be rather expected. I think we're kind of incredibly fortunate in a weird way that Donald Trump still supports charter schools, given that they are very explicitly not necessarily about the people who he is supposed to be speaking for in the Tribune for. And we were talking about Massachusetts earlier. We don't really know how this referendum's going to go. I hope it passes. I've tried to help it along the way. And I think I've mentioned this to Robert in a previous forum. If there was one or two great schools in Massachusetts, great schools, or Great Hearts Academy, sorry, and middle-class parents thought that they had something to gain from charter expansion, I don't think it would be quite so even. So kind of drawn out the whole, what we're doing and what we're left with, we do think of charter schools as buildings. It's not the kind of thing that 6 or 7 teachers can really do. It's more the exception than the rule when they say we've got a way of doing something different. Charters don't announce how they're going to test themselves and how they're going to prove themselves. That's mostly left to the authorizer. We don't really admit that we don't know things anymore. We think that we know things and we want to scale them. And we don't really think that we're engaged in a search anymore because we think that we have what works and we want to replicate that. But again, like if this is what we want charter schools to be and do, then we are doing everything right. If we want them to be more, then we should do something different. We should not default to charter advocates' metrics when it comes to state rankings. Again, kind of contra Jay, I think if you look at NACS's ratings over the past 5 years, you've seen a whole bunch of states shoot up at it because they're requiring authorizers to sign into statements of principles, evaluating authorizers and enclosing default shutdown provisions, all of which will homogenize the sector and lead it more towards this, but much farther away from that. We should say that all kids matter and mean it. I think when it comes to schools like Great Hearts, there's a suspicion, both of charter advocates and the policymakers that they have, that simply having a kind of education that you want to deliver is somehow a morally questionable thing compared to this. 10 minutes, I will be very quick. We should encourage more authorizers, a raft of small school ventures. We will not get what Tom talked about in terms of personal attention from authorizers if we have one authorizer trying to oversee 75 or 100 schools. We should not use standardized tests as a floor. We should use the judgment of authorizers, not necessarily based on a dashboard, but based on their personal experience. And we should talk to parents before closing a charter school, so at the very least we know whether or not they think their kid is maybe going to be faced by physical violence. Shanker said that charter schools were not a way of shoving things down people's throats, but he thought it was a way that we could take reform from being something that could be counted on the fingers of 2 hands, which I still think it is, to somewhere where we meet a few years from now, be able to talk about thousands of schools in this country where people belong, are building a new type of school that reaches the overwhelming majority of students. I don't think that we are on track for that nationally. However, I do think that there are probably some states out there, if they so chose, who could pursue a vision much closer to this and much farther away from the isomorphism that this conference is trying to tease out. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Matthew Ladner, and I just on Monday started at the Charles Koch Institute, actually, so I have a new job. I have basically a report and a plea, and to the extent that this conference is sort of an attempt to communicate with the 300, which I think that might be one of the subtexts here, my report is from one of the 50 laboratories of reform that we have in this country, and it's from the state that I live in, which is Arizona. And I'll get to the plea part later. So a few things that you may not know about Arizona. We're a medium-sized state. We have an unusual age demographic profile. We have lots of old people because people like to play golf in February, it turns out, so you keep moving to Arizona. We're also a border state, so we have a large and growing Hispanic population. I like to say that Arizona is the canary in America's coal mine because all 49 other states are becoming more like Arizona, and Arizona is becoming like something we've never seen before in terms of the number of old people. Because we have a very unusually small working age population, we have a low per pupil spending in our state. And we're not a wealthy state, although if you visit Scottsdale, you may think we are, but that's mostly retirees being wealthy, and they're not living there all the time. Arizona has what is generally regarded as the most liberal charter school law. We were the second state to pass charter schools. I believe it was 1995, it was before I got there. And we are colloquially known as the Wild West of charter schooling, right? Arizona traditionally has been, at least in the last decade or so, viewed with suspicion. Not by Jeanne, but by some of the other charter school groups. I know that NACSA, for instance, rated our charter school law, gave it a 9 out of 33 in 2014. Okay, so the laboratory of reform thing happened in Arizona the way it did because in the mid-90s when they passed the charter school law, the state was absolutely being crushed by enrollment growth. No one was interested in hyper-cautious authorizing when we had states that were, district schools were absolutely terribly performing. We were one of the lowest NAEP states in the country, and we were bankrupting ourselves to build more bad big box schools. Someone comes along and says, hey, how about charter schools? We're like, yes, please, we'll take them, right? In 2012, both Credo and a study by Brookings took a look at charter school results in Arizona and kind of found mixed to kind of mid, kind of negative results was their evaluation based on 2012 data, okay? Just in the last 3 years, though, something different has happened. It started with the 2015 NAEP, which has now produced 6 different evaluations, 4th grade, 8th grade, math, reading, and science. And on all 6 of those exams, each of which is a separate sample of students, okay? Arizona charter schools, if you look at their results separately, you actually find that Arizona charter school students scored in the rough vicinity of a New England state, okay? So for instance, in 8th grade math, Massachusetts, the highest scoring state, scored 297. Arizona charter schools were 296, okay? There was this consistent pattern on that. The National Alliance for Public Charter Schools actually has a dashboard of charter school, populations. What do the demographics look like? Charter schools in Arizona are educating a majority-minority student population. It's not quite as majority-minority as the districts, but it is still majority-minority. There is not a New England state that is anything close to majority-minority, okay? Of course, you must be very cautious when you are using NAEP scores and whatnot. These are samples of students. There's, measurement errors, this, that, and the other thing. I increasingly became confident as we saw the same sort of results time after time after time. But the real kicker came in when the Arizona Charter School Association got their greedy little hands on state testing data, okay? We give a PARC aligned exam. It's called AZ Merit. It's a completely separate source of data. It's not a sample. Basically, all the kids are taking it. And the AZ merit data actually showed a bigger advantage for Arizona charter school students than the NAEP did. So at this point, that was enough to convince me that we've got something really remarkable going on here. Okay. Now, some of these differences, if we're simply looking at a difference between charters and districts, some of it is due to differences in student populations. There's no doubt about that. But that doesn't explain being outscoring New Hampshire, right? For about half the cost, by the way, per pupil spending is a state like New Hampshire spends. So the difference, why I think that it could be correct that Credo and Marty West from Brookings are actually, I don't think that they're wrong. I think they may have accurately portrayed where things stood in 2012. Some of the earlier discussants mentioned this is a very complicated business doing comparisons between charter and district schools and whatnot, and there's lots of different factors. Marty West, for instance, found that in 2012 data that young schools scored worse, okay? The secret sauce, I believe, is actually sort of this choice-based model playing out and a process of creative destruction in a sense. In 2014, there were 605 charter schools operating in Arizona. By 2013, 289 charter schools had closed in Arizona, okay? There's actually a group that is opposed to charter schools that keeps data on this, and their spreadsheet has been very handy. When you look at the data and you see, just like Jeanne said in the outset, the average charter school that is closed in Arizona lasted 4 years and had 62 students enrolled in its final year of operation. Okay? The state of Arizona grants 15-year charters, and we're the Wild West. Now, we're not Hong Kong, I want to make that clear. We're the Wild West. There still is a role here. The State Charter School Board does occasionally close a school. But the overwhelming majority of schools being closed in Arizona, and I mean by a very wide margin, are being closed by parents, not by technocrats, not by state officials. Parents either deciding never to enroll their child there in the first place or enrolling their child and deciding to go somewhere else. I think we do see the sort of primordial soup of a choice-based system actually working out well. Mind you, almost 20% of the students are going to charter schools in Arizona, and we've got really good results, and for the most part, things are going well. My quick little plea to the 300 would simply be this. Please, please have some humility. We're figuring this out over time. We don't know what's best. I don't know what's best, so I'm not going to impose it on people. You don't know what's best either. Let's keep learning and let's do more research. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. So we're going to move over to Jonathan Hayes, who's founder and CEO of Charter Schools USA, who has a robust program and I'm sure excellent commentary, and also acknowledging that you have a limited amount of time. So thanks, Jonathan.
I apologize. Thank you so much. I am going to have to get out for a flight back. And I just want to first thank Jeanne. I do serve as the chairman of the Center for Education Reform. I've been on the board for many years. I know we have several board members here. And it's been, for me, a pleasure being a part of an organization that's willing to stand in the lurch of a movement that has, in many ways, being on the operator side, watching this from the beginning, has lost its way a little bit, and at the same time still has the tenacity and recognition to come back and try to get true north, and do that with research, do that with analysis, do that with evidence, and do that in a way that's also practical to the student experience and to the policies and to the public relations and all the other things that have to happen. So I want to thank CER and Jeanne, and I'm really glad to be a part of the team. At CSUSA, I was asked to maybe give you a more practical reality of what we deal with. We have 85 schools with almost 75,000 students across 7, now almost 8 states. We're about to go into South Carolina. And we've been doing this for close to 20 years. So we've seen it from the ground floor. We started with one small school, inner city, Liberty City area, down in Miami, 100 kids. And, over time, just fell in love with this movement and moved from a reformed researcher in my former life to being really a social entrepreneur and helping advocate for more and more choice directly for parents and then driving student achievement within those schools. I was asked to really speak to the regulatory environment and how that's actually working on the street inside schools. And this is generally speaking. This is not specific to any state. And so we have a cross-section of states here. And so let me just maybe give you a little highlight of how it's changing very rapidly. Earlier, some of the things that were brought up that I think are relevant are that the unintended impact of having a higher standard model for getting a charter approved. And every year, just to give you a sample of that, we apply from anywhere between 8 and 12 schools on behalf of nonprofit boards across the country. We get asked about we are asked to open over 100 schools, and we can obviously only manage. We opened up last year 8 new schools, the year before that 11, the year before that 15. So in that range is a sustainable growth model of quality and performance. In each of those times, rarely do I go into an authorizing body, whether it's a state, a district, university system, whereby the process has not become so cumbersome that anyone that isn't already well capitalized is dissuaded from the process itself. And so I look at it, if I was to come today with what the new idea or the early ideas I had when I was much younger starting this process, I don't think I would have ever gotten through the process to get a school open, first of all. Number two is we talked earlier about how innovation is stifled. Well, I consider innovation to be a part of the rubric of how we can be different and better in the charter school space. However, authorizers are using that now as a bureaucratic tool because it's ill-defined. Innovation is whatever they want it to be. Ironically, I'll give you a quick story. I was in Palm Beach County recently. We went through a process, and the application actually was replicating a high-performing school that was already operating somewhere in the state. And in Florida, they actually give you a faster track process if you're replicating a successful school. This was something we worked on policy-wise, made sense, and now this is starting to take root in some other states. Ironically, the only thing that they could mark us off is we weren't innovative enough. Why weren't we innovative? Because we were replicating something that was the same. Right? I mean, that's literally the game that's played. So what happens in those situations is if you're not well capitalized, if you're not in a position to fight, you actually just go away. And so we're in a position as a larger operator, and if you know my instincts as a former Green Beret, I fight when it's sort of put into a situation where I think the moral imperative says we have to fight for those kids. And we had strong demand, everything was there, so we have fought. That process has gone on for over 2 years. We'll actually probably end up in the Supreme Court of the state of Florida to fight a process like that, just to give you a sense of how hard it is now to go up against the regulatory bodies that have now made it their business to stop charters. And I think it goes in 5 steps. It used to be the inputs, right? You just make the application harder. And then it went to, you had to have the experience, right? If you didn't have the experience, you couldn't start it. Well, if you didn't get, how could you get it if you didn't start one, right? And then it went on to past performance and then innovation, and now it's just legal brute force and money as a way to sort of stop the growth of schools. I also heard earlier Jay Green, I know Jay is advocate and bullish of sort of how this continues in disregard to that kind of environment. I'm actually still bullish too, believe it or not. And the reason is because I believe, just like in religions, persecution drives a certain amount of tenacity, grit, and a willingness in a community to fight for the right thing. And so what I love about the movement today is that it's having to rebuild itself in ways because the regulatory environment, because the bureaucracy, because the processes have made it in many ways untenable. So it now makes parents have to re-engage. I found 5, 6, 7 years ago that we didn't have to have as many parents come out to advocate for a school opening because the process was so bureaucratized that if you checked off the boxes, you either got it or you didn't. And that wasn't good either for the charter movement. In some ways, I think we're coming back to the fundamentals. I think that's what this discussion's about today. Even in our own organization, I'm currently going through a re-look at, are we at True North? Are we about students first? Or are we just now in a position where we're just stamping out and opening high-quality schools? Or are we doing something different and better? So I also will tell you that I think the things that will help this movement and this space and this sector, because it's a little bit of all of those, continue to prosper, have really little to do with regulation and policy at all. It really has to do with more of the supply than the demand. The demand is there for the schools. We have tens of thousands of kids on waiting lists. There's still well over 1 million students in America on a waiting list to get in a charter school. But the supply is not there. There's not enough quality operators that are capitalized just like they would have to be in any other market-based function to be able to come in and understand the complexities of the business model, not just the academic model. And I really truly feel that most people have to lie on one side or the other of this. When schools fail because they're not operating in a business-like way, it's traditionally because they're good intended educators that really don't have the educational sense or the business sense around running a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And I think oftentimes when the business interests get involved without an academic vision, a caring for students first, and a commitment to that in a real way, then that also gets off. And that balanced approach, I think, has been one of the reasons that our organization has seen some of the success it's seen across the country. And I think that's what's also attributed to some of the other success. I also would like to comment on the fact that there's a natural aggregation that's going to take place in this movement, this market, this sector, just like it did in healthcare and other places, because at the end of the day, there is supply and demand, there are market forces here, there's dollars involved, and there will be competition. And so there will be those who start to be in a position where they're able to aggregate, and that's happening now. I talked earlier to Tom and others that there's already folks out there in the marketplace starting to say, hey, you know, you run a great school, or even a couple schools, but be a part of a larger network, share resources, begin to do the things that are done in the rest of the market in other sectors, and that is beginning to happen now, and I think that's a natural good outflow. I also think that there's going to have to be a true fight through on the issue of for-profit versus nonprofit. This issue continues to devolve into an internal civil war inside the reform movement. And at this point, I'm actually more at war oftentimes in markets with our nonprofit boards, with our advocates, with our teachers, on behalf of our model versus other charter models which see themselves as superior based on the market force of whether they happen to be under the nonprofit label or the for-profit label. And when people really strip that away, there really is no difference. Either you're a profit center in the sense that you're providing a service because you're Apple and you're selling that technology to that school, or you're providing a service that's curriculum related or HR related. And those services are either well performed or not. And nonprofit or for-profit should not dictate the results, and in fact, they don't. There's no data that shows that. In fact, we have data that shows that often capitalized for-profit service providers that provide services to nonprofit boards can do that in a way that's actually better because they're able to intensify their focus around research and development. They're able to push off costs, invest on the front end when the schools can't afford those services, and allow for the long-term success of that school to be shared with the service provider. So I think this internal debate is a false debate that must ultimately come to a head, and it's going to require the cool kids, so to speak, and the operators and everybody in the 300 Club to come together and at some point look at this, just like they did in healthcare. You know, there was a time when there wasn't a for-profit run hospital in this country. Today, 50% of the hospitals in this country are run by for-profit hospitals, and I guarantee you probably don't know which ones are and which ones aren't. I know when we went in prenatal care, we cared about the doctors in that hospital and the performance of that hospital and the health care of that hospital. We did not care about whether or not, at the end of the day, there was a shareholder return for quality performance. And so I think those debates have to be brought to forefront. My last point is I was asked to point out a couple practical ways for policymakers in the room of how to avoid the overregulation of charters. We're finding that what's happening is there's becoming an unholy alliance between sort of the authorizers and then the other bureaucratic entities such as municipalities, counties, and even state governments that aren't in the education business. So for example, transportation departments are now more and more regulating the off-site improvements of charter schools that are actually making it untenable for a physical plant to open. Now, sometimes these are because of traffic issues, and these are things that aren't really relevant, but they actually really matter because on the front end, they're putting costs into the project that make it untenable, while still most charters receive less money per student. So you're going in with oftentimes 20 or 30% less funding on the front end. You're going in with a model where you might have to actually take on more cost because a school district running a school doesn't have to actually meet many of the criteria. So in our world, we're actually seeing that there's more regulation right now in the charter school space there is in the traditional school space. It is more regulated on us on multiple levels, whether it's how we build our buildings, where we build them, and how many agencies we have to get approved by. School boards don't have to go through city and county approvals for the most part because they are their own LEA and they stand in a different position. So these kinds of fundamentals end up underneath the carpet. They start to build up into the dirt and the trouble that really creates people tripping up. And those are the things that on the ground we're seeing every day as we go out and fight the good fight of trying to grow the movement, be a part of the success for students, and seeing the accountability that's real, not the kind of testing accountability we talked about before, but the fact that we're getting about 96% of our kids into four-year institutions doing great jobs and great things over time. So with that, I apologize I have to leave early, but I hope that will give you a little bit of a practical reality perspective of what's on the ground, what we're up against, but at the same time, what I think we're able to fight through and how we're able to do that. Thank you.
That's great, Jonathan. In fact, I find it really interesting, the model of operators versus educators within a system, and really talking about that deep regulatory and business practice and understanding how many lawyers and people you need involved just to start a school, just to get things going, just to manage the finances. So thank you very much for that, and we're sorry that you won't be able to stay, but we have so many other people here to add to the conversation. And so, Mary, I'm going to jump to you. Mary Stafford is the co-founder of True North Education Partners, and I'm going to let you just start weighing in here.
Alrighty, thank you very much. I'm actually here on behalf of the Center for Policy Design in Minnesota, and I'm working on a project with Ted Kolderay, so that's part of what I'm going to talk about, and he's going to join us hopefully through the miracle of technology here in a moment and sort of embellish the ideas. But I'm very much representing the attitude and perspective of practitioners, so this is not my usual place to be. I opened my first charter school in Minnesota in 1997 in partnership with an organization that was then called the Edison Project, with some familiar names to all of you in the reform community: Chris Whittle, Deb McGriff, and John Chubb. John actually came to do our principal training. I was the principal, so he had to train me, and he'd never been a principal, so it was different in those days, yep. And although at that time there was much opposition, especially in the community I was in, because it was the first introduction of choice in the community, there was much opposition from those who saw it as a challenge to the status quo, but the environment in general, I would say, was much more supportive. And I think you're going to hear me speak to some of the same things that John did right before he left. Since that time, since I opened that first school in '97, I have opened at least 20 schools in a number of states with different providers, both for-profit and not-for-profit. Each year, my experience is in the charter domain, it's only become more difficult. And my most difficult, ironically, charter experience, and John reiterated some of this right before he left, my most difficult was in Minnesota, in fact, trying to open a small school of 150 children. Our focus was on age 3 through grade 3, so a focus on early literacy, personalizing the environment for very young learners, and engaging their families in really intentional ways on the front end. Our model, so we had, I'm going to speak to the different kind of authorizer. We had a hugely supportive authorizer. Minnesota enabled single-purpose authorizers, and we worked with an organization called Innovative Quality Schools, and they were way on board. They put us through a process that was rigorous, but at the same time supportive, and we got our application, or our affidavit in Minnesota, to the State Department. That's where we hit the roadblock. From that point on, it took us almost 3 years to open the school. So the experience of the regulatory environment and how, and the irony here is Minnesota is known to have, at least cited as, one of the best charter school laws in the nation, the first charter school law in the nation, some of the leading thinkers on the concept of choice, and it's been the most difficult place to work yet, so that's actually where I'm dedicating my time from now on. I was asked to speak about why innovation is important, and here I'd also reference a more recent experience. My most recent experience was working in Chicago with Chicago International Charter Schools, and my entity managed 5 schools for them, and we were privileged to get 2 NGLC grants in 2 consecutive years, and we worked with our partner, outside partner, Leap Innovations, Phyllis Lockett, who's a great supporter of the work, and we benefited from the learning of a lot of the people that are around me here today. But what was interesting there, it wasn't through anything but an external partner that we were able to innovate and resources brought to bear by an external partner. One of the things I think Ted, in the project that we're working on, is really looking at, probably most of you have seen his book around split screen thinking, and the notion that it's great, we have a lot of schools doing well, and they're built into a system that's managed, and the focus is on continuous quality improvement. But our charter sector has really moved away from the notion of innovation and its original intent. And so our thinking in Minnesota at this point is to try and refocus on that original intent and think about how that might look and how we might help organize things at the state level to really put Minnesota back in a place that would lead innovation in education. My recent experience in Chicago taught me another thing. I was doing consulting, still am actually, with Chicago Public Schools. And the teacher's contract that was finally ratified yesterday, Jeannie mentioned it earlier, prohibits any growth in the charter sector for the next 4 years. It's the first teacher's contract in the nation to do that. If John were here, he'd say we don't give up, right? So what we started to do within the district, seeing that coming, was developing internally cohorts of schools that were allowed to innovate. They were partnered intentionally with outside sources. The district allocated the resources to do that. And so although you're going to hear a lot about charter schools not happening, we're hoping and praying that through our efforts and the work of a lot of good principals and teachers, that we see innovation even stronger. But it's not a result of the system, it's a result of the external partners and the resources that have been brought to bear in the community. I think there's a natural tension between systems that are designed for continuous improvement. If you think of continuous quality improvement and Deming and measurement and all of that, they're designed to keep getting better, and that's terrific. But we do need another sector where it's okay to fail once in a while, it's okay to take risks, to be less cautious, it's okay to innovate. When you innovate, you make mistakes. You fail, and it has to be okay to do that. I'm honored to say that through the work of a lot of good teachers, I had a lot of schools that produced great test scores. And in fact, my personalized learning schools ended up doing the same, but there were some rocky roads in there, and we tried a lot of different things, and you don't get to the real kind of climate that's been spoken about earlier in the sense of community and the spirit of engagement for kids without taking some risks. And I think you'll hear Ted talk more about this, but I would, sort of in closing, I would say to the group, this is my first time at a conversation like this, which I've greatly enjoyed, and I feel honored to be up here, Jeannie, so thank you. At first I was like, what? I have to go up there? I'm usually out there. But I think there's one point from a practitioner's point of view that I would definitely bring up and ask you to consider, and that's the notion of district versus charter. I think the only way we're going to get real ed reform and revisit that original idea of innovation, and my bias is strongly in that direction, from standardization to personalization and working with kids and teachers, by the way, individually so they get what they need. It's not a curriculum. Each child ends up having their own, really, if it's done right. And those are the very best schools I ever experienced after doing this for many years with large organizations like John's, with teeny tiny ones like my own. And we're actually learning so much about the work from my next speaker here, my partner here. Thank you. Thanks. You got the clicker?
That's a good intro into the frame that I'll give. Hi, everyone. Michael Horn. I founded the Clayton Christensen Institute for Disruptive Innovation, left just over a year ago to, as I mentioned somewhat coyly in my last comment, to be in the gig economy, but to work with a bunch of organizations in the education space and to get a lot closer to the entrepreneurs who I think increasingly are the ones making the changes. That's yeah, not mine, but Bob, I'll try to do justice to you. And just the frame while we're bringing that up, that I'd say is, I'd love us as a group to also not just think about school choice, but think beyond that to educational choice more broadly. So the choices that students increasingly can have at connecting in different educational experiences, different pathways, different teachers, within schools, among schools, and even outside of schools completely, and acknowledging that that is all learning. And I'd like to broaden that conversation. And so my remarks are set against a bigger a sense of innovation and how we enable that. Still not up. I'll start with while we wait, a metaphor for how I think about this in some ways, which is, picture that you're going over to a friend's house and you're going to be the chef for a night. And your friend says, I want you to make the most innovative meal possible. But there's a couple catches. Here are the ingredients you're allowed to use, and only these ingredients. Here are the steps that you are to follow, and only in these particular steps in this order and for this amount of time for each step, and with these techniques, and on and on and on. What you get will be exactly what everyone else does, executed better or worse, but there's going to be no possibility for innovation. And so from a policy perspective, when we constrain and regulate and prescribe the inputs of the process, by definition, we will not get innovation, if innovation is what is needed. And so every organization has resources, processes, priorities, and then ultimately a value proposition that it delivers. And I think of the inputs as really those resources and processes. And if we constrain those, by definition, we will not get to, we will keep coming out with the same thing. I'm working on it? No problem. I can keep dancing. But the takeaway from that is that when we, our regulation, as Jeanne said in the opening remarks, I think what we fail to often acknowledge is that as we entered the accountability movement, and I share much of what's been, the sentiment of much of what's been said around that, but what we also haven't said today is that we layered that accountability movement over a long history of compliance-based and input-based regulation, and gave very little freedom to new thinking around what schools, or schooling, as Ted Couldery would say, should look like. And so as a result of that, metrics like seat time, metrics like what a student-to-teacher ratios, who a teacher is and the credentialing of those individuals that are allowed to be with students, have all been regulated in significant amounts. And so in many ways, you've heard a lot of people cry out over the last couple decades that there's too much business thinking informing ed reform. I just don't know any business in America that would say to a line manager, I'm going to hold you responsible for the P&L of this particular product or service, but you're not allowed to impact the people that you hire. You're not allowed to have any influence over the marketing budget and where you allocate dollars, and on and on and on. It's just, it's insane. And yet that's what we've done to our teachers and principals consistently, particularly in the district environment, but to some degree in the charter environment as well. So for a long time, so the first slide that you would have seen would have been to move beyond thinking about inputs to thinking about outcomes, which encourage continuous improvement toward a set of outcomes that we want, student learning outcomes, and create options. Now, the outcomes that I had on the slide that would be next are listed from INACOL, the International Association for K-12 Online Learning, where Tom's long been on the board, a set of 5 ideas of what these outcomes that we would be looking for are. A critical one that and mindful, Robert, actually, of what you said in the last panel on this, but is not just looking at proficiency rates, but individual growth, and mindful of the challenges with individual growth, particularly in today's environment. But a lot of the comments we've heard about how schools won't look good in the first year or second year actually go away if you look at true individual growth, as in where are students starting, the curriculum that they're working on, and measuring if they've actually, in fact, mastered that curricular, that understanding of that curriculum. And so if we go much more toward a growth mindset on the measurement toward mastery, I think you'd actually see something very, very different. That's the white paper, and that's not the. No worries. So the so the so the sorry. So their metrics, I believe, were individual student growth, proficiency, college and career-ready standards, graduation rates, and one more that I'm forgetting at the moment, or closing the achievement gap, I guess, was the last one. I think that one of the things that we also have to think about as we're in this policy environment is thinking about policy that works in different circumstances, and that as circumstances change, that certain policy solutions may not work as well. And so one of the things, the comments that Jay opened with, I think make a ton of sense if the consumers, if we're operating in Arizona where you have an education savings account at the beginning and you are making decisions over how to spend dollars that feel like yours. I think the evidence is that when the dollars are not yours, you don't make the decisions in the same way, potentially. And so I think it's important to be mindful of that. In a system where government, yes, even if dollars are following to the student level, but the student and family are not making those decisions, you see perverse behavior occur, and you've certainly seen that in the higher ed sector with Title IV, abuse of Title IV dollars over the last many years. I think ideally you would move into an education savings account system where there were dollars that student families actually had control of, and then were making allocation decisions. And then in that system, what I think you'd have a regulatory environment look at. I would be very wary of going to higher ed in the accreditation model to the last panel. People in higher ed think the accreditation system has failed beyond miserably and does a very bad job of either, if you're in favor of accountability or where I'm going on this, transparency to help students and families make better decisions. Accreditors don't do a good job of that at all. I think an interesting model to think about is more of an auditing model, where we're asking, in essence, schools and educational organizations to report out on the outcomes that they claim for students, be those learning outcomes, be those disposition, growth, whatever that means, and then matched with what students are saying they in fact got out of the experience afterwards, and whether that was in fact the intent that they were hoping to get, whether there was a match to purpose. And audit those claims. So on the assessment side, are these reliable, valid assessment items that they're using? Is there some measure of objectivity? Performance-based assessments, Tom, to your point, used in the Western Governors model, quite valid and reliable because it's a third party that are grading them in the higher ed space. It's not the teacher representing, trust me, this works. And so I think there's ways that we can start to think about that and have this auditing function start to look at that. I think if you move into that environment, you start to move toward an environment where students can start to make better decisions based on the goals that they have for themselves in the local environments that they are, and start to overcome some of this so that we'll have transparency to create true choice and truly informed choice. The last thing I want to say on that is Jeannie's point from the morning also of enjoyment doesn't equate to learning. And so I think we have to be wary of that because it's very easy to make choices just based on an enjoyable experience but not necessarily a learning one, which I think is why one of the critical questions isn't a net promoter score idea of do you enjoy this experience, but actually an ex post facto look at knowing what you know now based on the doors that this experience has opened up for you, the social capital you've gained, the learning, the knowledge that you've gained. In retrospect, was that an experience you would choose to repeat? I think that's actually a much more valuable question we ought to be looking at than a raw, did you enjoy this, which I think simplifies things in a dangerous way, not a helpful way. So I suspect I had more things to say, but why don't we leave it there?
Thanks. Actually, that was great. And now we also have Susie Miller-Carrello, who is with the SUNY Charter School Institute, which is your role is to comment on this, but I also imagine that you have a lot of ideas as well in terms of some of the regulatory barriers for growth and scaling in charters and choice. So Let's hear from you, and then we'll go and turn to questions and a little bit more conversation.
Great, thanks. This is kind of, I feel like maybe the afternoon sessions have all focused on how bad a bureaucrat your authorizer can be. And so since I have made once and I hear future folks that I authorize in the audience or the attendee pool today, I am cautious about what I say, and they will definitely call me on it. It's funny, I've also spent the day, and I warned Jay I was going to do this, about 1999, 2000, we both ended up in Buenos Aires together. And on that trip, it was a work trip. On that trip, Jace, I was the Associate Commissioner of Education in Massachusetts. Charters was under my basket. We were trying to figure out accountability models and metrics. And Jace said, you know, really, I think one of the best ways you can determine the quality of a school is whether or not parents choose a school and how long they persist with the choice of that exact school. And so that stuck with me. And in fact, every place I've been, that's been a part of what we do. Robert talked about how New York City DOE has a pretty extensive survey process from the students of the New York City charter schools, and we get that information back from the schools and use that as a part of quality as well. So I think the other framing piece of my comments is that anybody that's ever worked with me, when we have a hard problem or a crisis situation, I will draw a bullseye. I bet some of you do this too. We put kids in the middle of the bullseye. We put families around that. We put teachers around that. We put school founders and school board members around that. And we work out from concentric circles and trying to solve the problem. So if we miss it, if we mess it up at SUNY, it's not because we have our focus in the wrong place. But I'm always interested to hear more. This has been a fascinating day and my colleagues here on this panel, definitely fascinating to hear from. We at SUNY think that we need to be smart about regulations. We tend to call them policies, but smart about any regulations that we have for our schools, smart in helping our schools navigate the potential imposition of regulations from entities that are not their authorizer. As the State University of New York, we are not the substitute for the K-12 State Education Department. We are not the substitute for the New York City Department of Education, which for my schools offers them some opportunity for facilities, for bricks and mortar over their head. So we want to be smart about the kind of policy implementations or regulatory implementations we put on our schools. Because there are some I know this is just going to shock you, there are some regulations we really like at the Charter Schools Institute. Like, we really like it that there are criminal background check requirements for folks who are going to work with our kids every day. That's a regulation we really like. We really like it that there are regulations around transportation and other issues of child safety. We like some of the regulations about the safety setups of the schools. But that doesn't mean that we like all regulations, and as I say, we want to be smart about them. I thought Jeannie's comments also set this panel up very well this morning because all of your authorizers operate in an environment where they too have incentives to respond to. And I think we've talked a little bit about that today. We again try to do a really good job of diminishing that for our schools, and many of them tell us when we fail, but we usually actively ask when we're doing that and doing it well or not. I was fascinated to see the 700 hours of wasted time on a charter application. We, in fact, have diminished pretty significantly what we used to ask for, but we still get volumes of information back, which I think is really intriguing. So we have a ways to go yet, and sometimes that information doesn't help us make a decision, which I think was your point. And so we continue to strive to get better about that. We have 167 active charter schools this year that are authorized by the State University of New York. We have about 75,000 kids across all of our schools. And we have this reputation for being the authorizer of replicating networks. And we do, in fact, authorize replications of schools that parents are choosing and persisting with in droves and have outcome qualities for, high outcome qualities for those kids. And yes, that includes performance on state assessments, but it also includes things like state chess champions or ballroom dancing champions or a number of other areas. But as we kind of think about the kind of questions we get or responding to the environment that we're operating in, we are beginning to ask for more information from our schools, and I think that's one of the buckets we haven't solved well yet, is again in New York there are kind of 3 to 17 different entities that might ask our schools for information. We try to get as much information from those other entities as possible, and yet we still have to ask for information. Similarly, in New York, if you read the New York Times, you know we're getting lots of questions about who's enrolling in the schools, who's staying in the schools, who's being affected by what discipline strategies in the schools, and so we are asking our schools for more information about that. We want to do it in a way that's smart, and we also want to balance that request with perhaps some regulatory opportunities or policy opportunities that might allow our schools to look at. We talked about credentialing, teacher credentialing. We're the State University of New York. A year or so ago, our chancellor started talking about kind of micro credits and how we might be able to build upon those for students to achieve certain markers of success. We'd like to figure out maybe how that might apply to SUNY charter schools, and if that's kind of a policy decision we can make that would help our schools. I think the last thing I would love to contribute here is that circles back around to the environment we respond to. I believe New York's charter school law was ranked 7th. Did you say yours was 8th or 9th or something? We got a pretty low ranking from our friends at the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. Every year we seem to. Balanced against 70 to 80% of my schools outperforming their district of locations. I get it, I'm just quoted test scores. But I can give you lots of other non-test score examples for that. So I am confused then why our friends at NACSA publish something year after year that says New York is bad, but it would be better if you had us come in and evaluate your authorizers, which again would be an incentive for us to up our regulatory game.
Yeah, that's great. In fact, thank you. I think we have a few minutes for questions, if that's okay. I don't know if anyone wants to start with a question or want to think about kind of some thoughts on this. One of my questions that comes out of this, and hearing Jonathan and others in terms of how there's so much. There's so many different solutions. I want to kind of talk about even like the teacher preparation area that I happen to work in, which is this area around high-performing charters and charter school systems. Some public schools are also doing the same thing where they're coming up with their own teacher preparation programs, but yet they're all kind of reinventing the wheel themselves. The minute they get their own break, the door kind of closes behind them, and then all of that work that they did isn't being shared out, and of course they're going through sort of massive loops in order to solve their own problem of getting through the regulatory loops of whether it's training teachers, getting their own accreditation like High Tech High just did to start their own school of ed. There's all of these sort of great things that are going on to help scale good performance, but yet they're not really working amongst each other. Does anybody want to address that, or how what could sort of break that barrier down, or
We have an interesting situation out in Arizona where, we're literally thousands of teachers short, to start the August. When you're a fast growing state, over the last few years, like the kids in college have figured out that, like attendance at College of Ed has dropped like 30% in the last 4 years, right? I mean, we live in a world where no one stays in the same job for 40 years. And like suddenly the light bulb went off and said, getting this credential that's kind of only useful for one thing is not a very good career choice, right? So in Arizona, for 20 years, charter schools have had this bigger pond to fish in, right? They can hire certified teachers if they want to, and they do sometimes, right? But they've also had the option of having an uncertified teacher, right? And of course, the research shows there's no, in student outcomes, as far as we can tell so far, there's no advantage to traditional certification. Most district people I talk to, when you point this out to them, they say, yes, well, we couldn't possibly, blah, 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 right? Some of them are finally, it's taken a long time, but like some of them are now going, yeah, okay, right. It doesn't make any sense for us to handicap ourselves in that way. So I think that there is a lot of action going on. There's still a lot of people in the traditional districts who, are just clinging to this past view of the world that's quickly disappearing.
well, it's probably likely because it's how they were credentialed, and so how could you possibly come up with a new or easier or more fluid way of getting to that credential? One other thought on that is, what about the idea of as a piece of one policy proposal I've looked at is where high performance in schooling gives you right to opt into regulatory relief. In other words, we've talked about the whole concept of, you got to have a clean slate going in and be given the benefit of the doubt. But let's say once you've proven a certain amount, whether it's based on outcomes or you've cleared a few boxes that moving forward you could get more regulatory relief, whether it's for reauthorization or for doing special things or getting additional funding. Anybody have thoughts about that?
If you have a school with us and it's high performing, your renewal now is a pretty short experience. So we've both there and in granting new charters, it's a much shorter experience to get a new charter from the State University of New York if you're replicating a high quality program. And that is true for our schools that, like the autism charter school that we just replicated, or some of the larger networks that we have.
Great. Okay, Jeanne, you have a question.
Well, I just want to throw this on the table and hear you, Susie, and Michael, and whoever else wants to comment, talk about this. So, Christina, we've heard high quality, high performing, high success. An autism school may not be high performing in the way success is high performing.
high performing
We've tried,
in the way.
right? But high performing for that school. So that's just a comment and a caution. But I guess I would even extend that larger. Your question about releasing people, Michael, you've sort of the king of disruption. Once again, apologies for the PowerPoint, but you are the king of disruption, and when you think about even this conversation now, like when would we let them go, and how, and under what circumstances? There's an entire, nation of schools out there, charter, non-charter, voucher program schools, which you're going to hear about in the next panel. Shouldn't we be blowing us open in a bigger way? I mean, what happened with companies? If we did this to companies, what would be happening?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, from an input perspective, I don't think this should apply to any school, period. In terms of also quality, question, Jeannie, which glass is higher quality? It kind of depends on the use case, right? And so I think we never talk about that either in a lot of these conversations, and we think about quality as an absolute thing. It's not. It's not in any sector whatsoever. It's not in education either. I believe that there are a certain set of core knowledge concepts that are critical for being a functioning member of the society. And then I think that there's a lot of pathways people can pursue based on passions that are ignited in them. And so that's a lot of why I've been evolving, I would say, over the last year or two, to be thinking we have to go much more to this system that says, you as a school represent the claims on learning that you make appropriate to your school, and we audit to make sure that there's a process in place that we trust. how exams or assessments or whatever you use are given, the process by which you use to say that these assessments are valid and reliable. And then we throw that open. We look at then placement rates into other programs. We look at longitudinal placement rates into career outcomes. We look into and match that against students' qualitative experiences against what they were trying to achieve and say, is there a good match there?
Susie, you have something?
I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what constitutes quality, and I think the last panel touched on this, and Bob tried to push them on it a little bit. So we have a set of 28 qualitative benchmarks that we've used substantively since the first schools were renewed by the State University of New York, that are combined with this accountability plan that is more focused on academic outcomes. Here's the rub. Always are schools at the State University of New York who serve, my mother calls me this term, so I mean this in the most respectful way to children, calls the square peg kids, like all the schools are round holes, and then there are the square peg kids. And so I say to every one of my schools that are kind of working with kids who are not well measured by that ruler thing we call the state assessments, put them in there. What do you got? If you're an overaged, undercredited school and you're working with adjudicated youth, count up and report to me how many times your safety net has interacted with their probation. Count up how many times your young female student who's parenting both her small children and her grandmother has been, count up. Give me the count, to report it to me. Put that, just put it in there that you're going to report that. And it's an elusive concept about how they can count and report for the schools to do that. It's our next big, I think, our next big push is how do we get those, I credit Jeanne with this term, co-academic measures counted. It's in my head that you taught me this term, so if that's not true, I'm sorry to the person who really taught me that term. But I credit Jeanne with it because those are important markers of success for me until I can count your overaged, undercredited kids who have gone off to college. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Seth, introduce yourself.
I'm Seth Andrew, formerly of Democracy Prep, now Revolutionary Education Ventures, Rev, and we are thinking about what comes next in schooling and education. And I have two somewhat unrelated questions. The first is Susie and the rest of the team, and Susie knows this well. We've talked a little bit today about the school closures as the strategy to sort of provide accountability at the bottom end of the bell curve. And Arizona is, one of the kings of school closure. And what Susie did when she led the work at SUNY was to think about closure in a different way, restructured renewal, where schools that were low performing were taken over whole cloth by a high performing operator, leaving the kids in place, the building in place, the community in place, the safety net in place, but changing the academics and the structures. And I'm wondering why we haven't heard that be more part of the national dialogue around charter, low quality accountability. And then a second question, somewhat unrelated, Michael hinted at this, but we haven't talked about it either. We've talked all day about the unit of change being school choice. And school choice, whether district or charter or voucher, whatever the choice mechanism is. And I think we are at the precipice of the moment where we can really talk about course choice. And that the building, the physical place that kids go is a community where they have relationships and connections and conversations, but that what they're doing academically is actually disaggregated in really meaningful ways. So whether that's the use of virtual reality or other sort of blended tools, that the idea that kids can now have across one school unit 20 different educational experiences that are personalized and blended and thoughtful. And now we need to start thinking about the accountability in the next 10 years for not the school, which is the unit of measure we've talked about all day, but actually the course of study, the course choice that kids are taking. Because 3 kids in the same school may take 3 different chemistry courses on 3 different virtual reality platforms. So how do we start to hold those individual courses accountable as opposed to the school, which may have offered them and created that choice mechanism, but shouldn't be necessarily held accountable for the results of different chemistry options that they're presenting to their students and their families. So first is sort of how do we change the paradigm from school closure to school renewal and restructure renewal. And the second is how do we move to an accountability structure around course choice, not just school choice.
I can tell you on your first point, I'm actually aware of a financial firm that has gotten into the business of locating low-performing charter schools that are unlikely to be renewed and actually buying not only their building but also their charter and then getting a high-quality operator in there to do exactly what you're talking about. So I think that's just a fantastic idea. It's not independent on the state doing things right. It's it's voluntary exchange, right? It's a great thing. On your second point, I want to echo what Michael said earlier. Education savings accounts really are something that will sort of move the ball forward on this disintermediation of education beyond even just course choice, all the way out to different types of educational methods. If we want to have parents, if we want to empower parents with the ability to seek the highest value for their education dollars, you ultimately, the experiments are running around the country in small ways are basically allowing parents to do that, and some of them are customizing and mixing and matching using different, school part of the day and private tutors and online things. It's a journey of discovery, and I don't have a lot of evidence to give you yet, but these are the type of experiments I think will lead to the answers to the questions you're looking for.
I'd also love to see, so just a bit of history. Julie Young's in the audience, who founded Florida Virtual School, and their courses were funded on a performance basis. So, and the unfortunate thing at some point was that it switched to 100% of the funding was on successful completion or not of a given course. And many of those actually had an assessment at the end because of the policy in Florida at the time. This set off a model of intrigue of as you start thinking about down to the course level or module or learning experience, could you pay for performance in some way? The concern I think a lot of folks had was when it's 0 or 100%, are you incentivizing the innovation and risk tolerance that you'd like to see in that model as well? I think a really intriguing model that has popped up in New Hampshire is the Virtual Learning Academy Charter School, VLACs, where in essence you get paid as you make progress. So average daily attendance, seat time, which is how we fund schools today, has been replaced with progress through a given course. So when you master, it's competency based. So when you master 10%, they get 10% in the funding. Next 10%, they get the next 10%. I'd love to see more experimentation in those models for actually paying for the learning itself. Because I don't think we fully know what the implications of that will be, but even in the higher ed sector where you've got Western Governors University or College for America, some of these competency-based models, they're still time-based funding models. And so I would love to see how that might flip on its head. And then the audit function I was describing, I think works actually very well for a learning experience. We designed it at Entangled Ventures for a boot camp world for the EQUIP program, the particular one that I'm talking about, and I think it works very well in a more micro educational experience.
And, just very quickly to the first question of why aren't we hearing more about authorizers having your practices, I think that take the cynical view of it, it's because of numbers and PR. The fastest way that you can possibly show sector-wide gains in a given state is to shut down low-performing schools. And then you can say something like, as the president of Nexus says, hey, teachers unions, you want to shut down low-performing charter schools, so do we. And if you think that's a savvy political strategy and your goal is to raise sector test scores, then you're going to do that. But even when it comes to an authorizer like SUNY, given the sheer amount of schools you have to oversee, I kind of worry that some of the schools that we might see that done to, are they actually failing? Are they actually low performing? I'm not speaking to yours in particular, but in general, if the model is having an authorizer oversee dozens upon dozens of schools, do we really trust the knowledge of that authorizer? And so to me, one way to shift more towards it is to allow more authorizers to flourish, to oversee smaller schools and smaller operations. That's not the direction that things are trending, but I think that could take us one step closer to there. I
have a question, then we'll go back to our question in the audience. And Max, you may be able to address this, but given the sort of turning everything back to the state's position of ESSA, can you, I know you've written a little bit about this, but talk to where the opportunities are, or are there real opportunities for there to be more programs like in New Hampshire that like Michael's talking about, or where there's more experimentation to be able to be done, or where there's more opportunities for this let's try new things and and be able to get those things done in the new system? Or is it too constraining still?
I think it's a little bit too early to tell across a couple things. I'll say what I'm most excited about and what I'm most worried about.
Okay.
What I'm most excited about are the possibility of states letting CMOs and independent charters operate independent teacher prep academies, which would totally obviate essentially any licensure requirements and give charter schools the ability to train their own staff from day one. I'm very excited about that. What I'm very worried about are charter schools being attempted to be designated as an LEA for accountability purposes. I have no idea what a Hillary Clinton administration will do to regulate charter schools. And I think about this a lot and I still have no idea. So I'm more worried from that shift to ESSA than I'm excited about opportunities for large.
What about the whole sort of concept that if it's not regulated, then let's try it? So for, whether it's the finding ways of moving on seat time or moving on ways of just of innovating that may not be regulated or something that you might be able to do at the state level. And I don't know, Michael, if you want to talk to that, or Matt, if you have any more on that.
Well, slightly different angle on it. I mean, I rather than states coming up with the report card of how they'll represent results, I'd much rather see lots of local experiments within the states to start to understand what these different dashboards and measures of performance and transparency could look like. Because I think we'll get a lot more innovation that way rather than designing the perfect California monstrosity or Florida simplicity.
Well, yeah. And it's almost begging the question at this point, right? Because the amount of eyeball traffic that some of the things like great schools, and there are competitors to great schools out there, have simply dwarf anything at a state Department of Education. And it kind of begs the question, right, as this already started, is great schools like the proto-Yelp for school transparency? And I think the answer is yes. It certainly seems that way to me in Arizona. I know people are going to great schools a lot. They value the parent reviews. The rating system that great schools use, you can like it, you can not like it, but it's the one that people are looking at. It's actually far more rigorous than the state's rating system. I think it's kind of already started.
Okay, go to the audience, and then I hope we have time.
So innovation is really messy, right? If I'm starting a school and using some kind of lean startup model, I'm failing and trying again, and if I'm trying to do that, I'm going to be the last one to say, let's pull the plug. So my question is really around an authorizer who, on one hand, you might call skittish, on the other hand, you might call properly protecting the public good, right? How do you negotiate that so that there's a time to pull the plug? How do I know what system do I put in place so that I know that, yep, this one failed, this one deserves some more time?
I think it's better if you let parents do it. I mean that's, again, we do have state authorities that do very occasionally close charter schools in Arizona. But it is far less contentious, right? When you think about who fights to keep a low-performing charter school open, mostly it's the parents, right? Well, when the parents themselves close it, that kind of goes away, right? And it is a non-issue that 289 charter schools have closed in Arizona. It does not hit even the last page of the newspaper when it happens. It's just a fact of life. Now, different states have different cultures on that sort of thing and different amount of tolerance. So, I mean, it is far better to let parents put things, like, and when Jay talked about fake accountability versus real accountability, let me suggest that that's real accountability, right? When parents are viciously doling out accountability at the school level in Arizona, they're closing schools. If they don't like you, you're dead, right? And it doesn't take 15 years, it takes an average of 4 years.
Thanks, Matt. We're going to have to, can we save our question for the next session? We're going to wrap this one up, but thank you very much. That was wonderful, and we're going to move on to our next session.